Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for engaging conversations about the topics that matter most in our culture. If you love nuance, if you want to better understand different points of view, if you're tired of the screamers taking all the oxygen out of the room, if you'll enjoy edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me, you love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, joined by the dynamic, diehard reporter, Jessica Stone. Jessica, nice to see you. How are you?
That with my gloves on.
All right.
Rocky music.
We missed you on the Trippy show, that Joe Trippy and
Can't get quite as trippy without me, I know, but
yeah,
hey,
see?
your dad did a great job.
Wow, yeah.
Ronnie.
He's inimitable. Well, he's very imitable, but anyway. Okay, we are co-produced by my pal Tristan Drew, and if you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, leave us a review and comments on iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a shout on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We would love to hear from you. You may have heard the name Christy Smith mentioned on this program before. Assemblywoman Smith was the California State Assembly member and more recently ran for U.S. Congress in California's 25th District, which Republican Mike Garcia ultimately won by one of the thinnest margins in the country, 333 votes. Say it with me, that's less than 0.1%. I got to know Christy when she was serving in the state assembly initially at the Home and Garden Show, and I'll tell a little story about that later. Christy then came and spoke with the Santa Clarita Valley Business Group, and we got to know each other a little better that year when she was serving in the assembly. And then I served on her Small Business Advisory Committee. And just recently, Christy has announced that she's running again in an attempt to unseat Mike Garcia as our representative in Congress. Christy Smith, what an honor to have you with us. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to be here with both of you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. Well, I wanted to start by getting a little bit about your background. Now, one of the things that I didn't know when I was doing some prep for this was that you were born in West Germany.
I was born in Germany. My dad was in the service during Vietnam. He didn't see combat, but he was in a technical position working on radar communication, and had married my mom, and she went over and lived with him on base. But I was married, or no, they were married, but I was born in a German army hospital.
And then it was Germany to Indiana?
Germany to Indiana when I was 6 months old. Both parents were originally from the Midwest, and my dad from Kentucky. And so I spent from 6 months until 10 years growing up in Indiana with grandparents and cousins and all that great stuff, getting my Midwestern sensibility and stripes. And then my dad got a job out here in California. So we moved to California in October of '79.
Oh, so you were barely 10 years old at that point.
Yeah. I'm a transplant, almost qualify as a native, but not quite.
Yeah. At a certain point, you're a naturalized Santa Claritan.
Yeah.
And then you really are Santa Clarita, California 25 through and through, Hart High School, COC, stayed in SoCal to go to UCLA. I'd love for you to take me through some of that, your education and what your focus was coming out of college.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you know, because you've been raising your kids here, it is the great kind of suburban community that a lot of people want to be able to raise kids in. Incredibly safe, great, well-funded public schools, beautiful parks and open space, well-run local governments. I mean, at the time I moved here, we were still just under LA County, but then the city of Santa Clarita incorporated. And so it was a great place, to grow up, to kind of have that idyllic childhood, and then having that balance with what I had seen, a little bit growing up in Indiana, when I lived in neighborhoods that weren't certainly as diverse as the one that I moved to here, in California, and met people from all over the world here in California that were part of our neighborhoods, and thought, just how amazing and cool that was. And so grateful to my parents for the breadth of experience that has given to my life. But, like a lot of people who go into public service, the reason that I aspired to politics, first of all, was in fifth grade, which is that first time that you get a bite at the apple of our founding fathers and our Constitution and American history. Just fell in love with it, just fell in love with how our government is structured, how amazing it is that it's open to everyone. Literally anyone can still dream and aspire to be president and get there. And so knew that that's what I wanted to do with my life. Up till then, for some reason, it had been dentist. And then fifth grade, that shifted and dentist turned to public servant. But, spent a lot of my time either working in groups that were politically affiliated or certainly at Hart High School, did my time in student government, which I loved because it was just kind of small scale, providing leadership, but to the campus in a really fun way. And then went to College of the Canyons. Like a lot of kids facing decisions around college now, by then my parents had divorced. Sadly, there was domestic violence in my home. My parents had split up. And although I qualified for a lot of universities in state that I had applied to, I couldn't afford it. So went to COC as a student and worked 3 jobs to put myself through. I had a morning nanny babysitting job. I then went to class and took classes till the end of the day. And then at the end of the day, had a job on campus partly in the admissions office, partly in the counseling office. And then on the weekends, I worked as a server in an assisted living facility out here in Santa Clarita. So know the value of hard work and dedication that it takes to get through college. But that was back then when you could do it, when you could work and afford to pay tuition. And now, young people or people wanting to go back to school can't even do that with 3 jobs. So all of those experiences in life that I had along the way, what propelled me to keep going in public service, because I knew that the best way to make a difference in people's lives and help shape them was through government, and where government is investing its resources and how it's supporting people.
Now,
can I ask a question about pulling teeth? Because I think there might be an analogy between dentistry and politics. If you had to pick one instance in your political career where you truly felt like you were doing an extraction that was that challenging, and keeping in mind that you didn't go through dentistry school, so maybe the anesthesia part might not have been part of it, although you might have wished that you could have undergone
Right.
anesthesia. Right. Is there some sort of tenacity that it took to just really get an issue to the table and across the finish line that maybe has some parallels for you as in your political life?
Oh, absolutely. And I love the question. That is just fantastic. A couple of things, but there were 2 of the bills that I carried as a freshman legislator in the state assembly were some big ones that were controversial. One was around California charter schools and making sure that we had more governing transparency and clarity in how charter schools operate in California. And since the Charter Schools Act had been enacted, it was 20 years and no one had really touched it. And the parameters, it was leaky. It was a leaky bill, and there were a lot of holes that needed filling in. And my bill was one that did that. And it took a heavy lift, especially for a freshman legislator coming in who didn't have the relationships in the institution, and certainly not the relationships outside the building of all the people who were weighing in on the issue. But I was persistent, transparent, forthright, kept our Charter Schools Association and their affiliates at the table through, the whole conversation. And we finally got to a place where the bill passed and, was implemented this last year. So, that's one I was really proud of. And then there's another one that I just recently got statistics on. In fact, it's to support victims of human trafficking from our state's Victims Compensation Fund. And it hadn't previously been done. And through multiple cycles, other legislators had carried this bill. It was a Women's Caucus priority bill, and it had been to the governor's desk a few times, but never gotten signed. And so the barriers to it were, where's the funding going to come from? And then if we can find the funding, can we find a governor to sign it? And we were able to accomplish both of those things. And like I said, just found out recently in its first year of implementation, it benefited about 75 victims of human trafficking in the state of California, with grants that are about, $13,000 each, but that's grant money that helps them restart their lives after they've been victimized in that system. So that was one, it took a lift, but it was worthwhile. And now to hear the outcome is pretty incredible.
Okay, so I heard leaky bill. I thought plumber, but I won't go there. I'll let you ask the next question. Corey, my punniness may not carry us through the rest of our podcast interview here.
One transformation that I was curious about was when you were a young adult and in your early voting life, you were a Republican and at one point transitioned to becoming a Democrat. What ultimately led to that transition?
Well, growing up here in Santa Clarita, historically, it had been a more conservative, suburban community. And so those were the influences that I grew up with. And there wasn't a lot of very open conversation about politics. It was just sort of, we're all down for a government that, works for everybody. But as I started to go through college, had greater experience in the world and through my learning, realized that there was a much more important and broader role for government to play in people's lives than was supported by Republicans at that time, and certainly, not now. And then also as a woman who is very affirmatively pro-choice, that was one of the issues where the party started to go strictly in one direction and I was in another, and just didn't really feel like there was a place for me in the party. So my first presidential did vote for George Bush Sr. Still, as I let you know, Corey, once I got the Bush Quail t-shirt in my closet still to prove it. And, I would like to see us get to a place in this country, though, where that's what the differences between the two parties look like, where it's, yes, we're going to disagree on issues and approaches and probably economic theories, but at the end of the day, we're all in this pulling in one direction, ultimately for the good of the country.
So, as noted before, this district is a very closely divided district. In fact, I just saw recent voting, public records of public voting records that indicated Santa Clarita Valley is 48% Democrat, 47% Republican, and 5% independent. We currently have a representative that seems to be governing in such a way that he's representing the furthest fringe of just one faction of his party. Are there views that you still hold that would be considered conservative, more conservative, maybe even to the right of the current Democratic Party?
I think when it comes to some economic issues, that's where I'm more centrist leaning. Not a big fan or supporter of the notion that trickle down economics has served us well by any stretch of the imagination, because I don't think that's where we are. But I think when it comes to competitive business practices and in the business environment, and you and I have discussed this, with you serving with me, it's, sometimes the hand of regulation becomes so overly burdensome and not supportive to business in ways that hold people back and hold back innovation. And it's just something we need to be continually mindful of. It's something that, tends to be associated more with Republicanism than Democrats. But certainly there are Democrats who are business minded and we think about it. But right now, for people who may have gotten past them, this Republican Party in their last convention didn't ratify a platform. They just went forward with, nominating Trump as their presidential nominee and didn't really address many of the huge topics, burdening the country right now. And so I don't know, honestly, where Republicans stand on some things. Local Republicans, if you engage them, you'll get answers, at the city level or what have you. But from the federal perspective, I really don't know what it is that Republicans are for these days.
Let me bring up something along those lines. Of course, your current Congressman, Mike Garcia, has been rated by Project 538 as pretty strong supporter of the Trump administration's policies. I think he voted 100% along with them in the 117th, 81% in the 116th Congress the last 2 years. And I think in a district that is so close as the percentages that Corey just laid out, I wonder what you're telling voters about your ability to buck the Democratic Party machine in the House. You're running to represent your constituents, but are you willing to part ways with Nancy Pelosi and the House majority in some tangible ways if it serves your constituents, and what might those be?
Sure. Well, I mean, a great example that I have of that here in California was at the end of the last legislative year when I was in the assembly. We were on budget votes, and we could foresee the devastation that COVID might have had on our economy here in California. And one of the budget proposals was to limit small businesses being able to deduct losses over the 3-year period that they ordinarily would. And to me, to have said that as a state, for the right reasons, we put these health practices and procedures and public health requirements and guidelines in place that really, really impacted small business the most, to have then limited the extent to which they could find any relief in our tax system until that was released just didn't seem right with me. So that was one vote where I decidedly voted against party lines. And when you do that, you need to reach out to party leadership to let them know that you plan to do it and the why you're going to do it. And very often it comes with consequences, and which in my case it did. I was removed from a leadership spot because I didn't go with the caucus on that budget vote, but I don't regret it. And I would have done it again. And, it comes down to having guiding principles in government. And my guiding principles are: do the greatest amount of good that you can for the greatest number of people with the resources that you have at hand and you have at your disposal. And sometimes those things don't line up. And so you've got to make really tough policy decisions about, okay, this seems well-intentioned, but do we have enough money to carry it out? And does it have any unintended consequences that are going to be negative for people that we didn't intend to capture in whatever this piece of legislation is? So it's important to do the work well and to really understand all of the aspects of public policy, the economic implications as well as the societal implications, and make sure that you've tried to think all that through and process it to the greatest extent possible before you take a vote.
I was really curious about that because I can attest to your inclusive way of governing. If I remember correctly, I think the way that I introduced myself was, "Hi, I'm Corey, and I didn't vote for you."
Right.
And I told you why is because I felt that we needed some conservative, fiscally conservative voices in the state legislature. And that was, largely the reason, as a small business owner. And to your credit, not only did we have a very winsome, engaging conversation there at the Home and Garden Show, you then had a long conversation with my precocious 20-year-old, well, she was 18 or 17 at the time, daughter at the time. And you also went as far as including me on the small business committee when you were in the assembly. And I did see that some of the things that we discussed, we were a diverse small group of small business owners from every part of the political spectrum. And we did see that some of what we discussed in that room from all of those diverse voices got included in legislation that you were supporting. I was curious, so you just discussed it just now a little bit, what that cost you. How did you, why did you choose to go about it in a more truly inclusive manner? And what did that cost you politically?
That's a really good question. And what it gives me the opportunity to talk about is how concerned I am right now for where our country's politics have gone and how absolutely polarized they are. It's one thing to choose up red team or blue team in the heat of an election battle. But once that person's elected, it is their job to govern for everyone. And what we're not seeing, I think, in a lot of our elected officials is this notion that they are governing for everyone. I would be remiss if I left off about half of my constituency because some of them may not agree with my approach to things, when I would be a much better legislator if I gave them a seat at my table and understood their perspective, where they're coming from. And again, maybe there are implications that I haven't thought about a decision that I'm going to make and how it impacts, this person's life. And so that, also part of why I approached governance with these advisory councils. So you were on small business, but I also had them in public safety and education, worked extensively with our nonprofits in the community to make sure that I was getting that well-rounded view of all the things that were going on in the community to inform my decisions. To do otherwise would have been irresponsible, would have been partisan, sure, but not the responsible thing to do when it comes to the job of being a legislator.
Yeah.
So I got to tell you, I live in Washington. I may be much more jaded than both of you. I think you're going to be so frustrated here based on that response, like brick wall after brick wall. And so I guess I wonder, have you reached out to people like a Susan Collins or a Lisa Murkowski or a Joe Manchin, or, and we don't have any blue dog Democrats. I understand the point about how you need to campaign and how you want to serve your constituents. But the game is even more red team, blue team here, to the point where the only leverage you might have is if you become one of those centrist voices, like the three people I just mentioned, that can get something for your district because you're the deciding vote, which is harder to do in the House than it is in the Senate. So I just wonder if you talk to anybody who's been in that position about, what does it take?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've reached out across the Democratic caucus, to be sure. And there's a more centrist, more moderate faction. There's also progressives who I have spoken with and agree with them on a whole host of issues. And so I think it's important for us to always remember, though, that at the federal government level, the founding fathers and subsequent changes to our Constitution and how we govern are intended for us to move incrementally, to not take huge swings that are hard to recover from if they go wrong. And so just acknowledging that that's what I'm committing to, right, is a process that's going to take a long time, that a lot of times it's going to be about coalition building, and you might have a bill in mind or even an amendment to a measure that you're going to have to work really hard for, right? You're going to have to take a lot of folks to sit down and have a coffee, make a lot of phone calls, and do that hard work. But it's through that coalition building and consensus building where the good governance happens. And I want to go to Washington to be one of those people who reinvests in that notion. I think I see it beginning to break down in a number of ways. I appreciate that you're jaded. I get it. Maybe I would be, after a decade of hard work, but I do know, some very long serving members who have been there and who have been successful from both parties and still go every week and gut it out because the work is worthwhile. So I'm still optimistic for now.
I would say, if I gave you some unsolicited advice, which you didn't ask for, but I want to give it to you anyway, is, what is your level of commitment to being here? Because you want to be in your district, but I think a big piece of why members of Congress are not talking to each other is because they're not living near each other anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that's part of it. And I recognize that even with the short trip that I was taking weekly to Sacramento, which is only an hour flight, but I was there for sometimes 5 days a week. It takes a toll on your relationships in the district, and both things are equally important.
Yeah.
And I've heard rumblings over the last year that there might be some consideration given to the congressional calendar and what that looks like to help members try to find, that right balance. And I think it's certainly something worth looking at and investing in. Being all the way on the opposite coast, that is going to be a huge challenge because I do want to be in district, right, and be here for part of that. But you're absolutely right. I think members who fly in, take votes, sit in committee, they're not really having time to build those relationships and have those conversations. It does impact the work. Absolutely.
And your style of governing needs that, it seems to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There is the problem solvers caucus and growing movements like that indicate there are more folks than maybe that don't necessarily get as much attention as, somebody who saes something that, that puts them on the Sean Hannity show,
Corey?
What's that?
Who could you be talking about there, Corey?
No, it's a growing movement. I think that right of center, former Republicans, we've talked a lot about them here on this program, the Lincoln Project, the Bulwark, the Dispatch, media outlets, PACs. There are all kinds of, we just interviewed Elizabeth Newman, the, GOP Accountability Project. So I think that there's a lot of good-willed people that have a lot of experience in government and in the private sector that want to cut through what seems to be dominating the headlines, what seems to be dominating the agenda in Congress. I have a question about how you're going to end up threading a really difficult needle. And California 25 is a uniquely purple district, I think. not I think, it's a purple district just based on the numbers and how close a lot of these elections are. We don't know how it's going to be redrawn, but in order to get through a primary, there are a few different challenges. One is just the money. I mean, we saw, and I know Jessica has a couple questions about this, but we saw that Mike Garcia raised just under $10 million for the last campaign between the primary and the general. And you raised a pretty healthy chunk of money as well. That's got to be difficult, but part of that is being able to win over the base, those folks who are going to donate large donations, as well as enough of the passionate base who are donating $100 at a time and $25 at a time and $5 at a time. In order to do that, you have to be pretty orthodox as a Democrat. But in order to effectively represent the district, your rhetoric in the general has to calibrate a little bit toward the center. How do you do that? How do you do that balancing act?
The sailing analogy, I think, is in order here.
Tacking this way.
Tacking, yeah.
Tacking. Look, here's the thing. I mean, I think you know this about me, Corey, but I don't take lobbyist money and I don't take corporate PAC money. So that changes the dynamic for me. So literally I am just directly to donors. But here's the thing. I wouldn't underestimate the savvy of donors. They know that candidates run in districts like mine all the time, and that means a more nuanced approach to the work. And it means sometimes threading the needle and probably not being with any particular donor's political agenda 100% of the time. And most of the people, by and large, most of the people who donate that I speak with are like that. Like they just get it. They get politics writ large and how hard districts like these are. The challenge now is that we have to do it at all. When you're talking about those kind of millions of dollars, he raised 10, I raised nearly 6. He ran for a year longer than I did, though, unfortunately, because of what happened with Katie Hill. This is where we got to start talking about money in our politics. And I say this as someone who was a school board member when I started my time as a public servant. And so I can tell you how many teacher salaries that is, right? I can tell you how many upgrades to a school building, $10 million will buy you, a whole host of other investments that we should be making in our communities and in our neighborhoods with that money, instead of having to dump it all into a process that most Americans want to participate in anyway. So I'm a big fan and proponent right now of what's happening with HR 1. I would like to see it all go further. I think there should be hard caps and hard spending limits on all of these races, including the fact that, independent expenditure committees can come in and just dump unlimited amounts of undisclosed money into races like mine to try to sway folks. But we need to change it, because if we're going to restore governance and leadership to the voters, to the people whose hands it should be in, there needs to be a lot more balance in that system. And we've got to stop wasting these resources.
So you talked about the money that you don't take, but some money that you definitely do take is from unions. A lot of your funding comes from the unions, in particular, the largest teachers union, the American Federation of Teachers. They gave you about $25,000 last election cycle. Obviously, Randy Weingarten, the leader of the AFT and the spokesperson for AFT, has been heavily in the news because of COVID and the school shutdowns. And I wonder what you think about the criticism of the union and its participation in being slow to reopen schools and the ensuing concerns about children and education, particularly in urban populations.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that question a lot, because, as someone who was governing during the crisis and recognizing that in the beginning of the COVID crisis, just the actual data set was so limited. We were making decisions based on what public health officials thought the virus was doing, was capable of, how fast it was spreading. So getting in real time, the different systems and metrics to chase that, to track it, to have testing and so on, we were kind of flying blind to a certain extent. And teachers unions, like every union, one of their primary goals is to keep their workforce safe. And, we're having this big national conversation right now about investment in infrastructure. And there are school buildings across this country that are decades out of date with their ventilation systems, with heating, with air conditioning, that are so woefully underfunded that maybe they don't even get cleaned by a custodian every night, right? Maybe this is an every other night prospect. And so sending a teaching force back into classrooms with an insufficient data set, with not knowing what this virus was going to do in the bodies of children and teenagers and how fast it could, move there. Teachers unions across this country did the right thing to keep their teachers safe. Now, the challenge was that some of these same school districts weren't resourced enough to put a piece of technology or equipment in every student's hand so that they could effectively do class online, right? There are hundreds of thousands, millions of kids across this country that don't have broadband access, don't have Wi-Fi access, and they certainly don't have a piece of equipment at home that would allow them to log in for class. So education, like so many other aspects of society that we found out during this crisis, still have these huge uncovered gaps. It was brought to light by our country's teachers. And what I was hoping would be the case is that this would be an aha moment for the American population to say, wow, we respect our teachers, because that's consistently the case in polling. Most people will say, I trust my child's classroom teacher, but then somehow when it gets aggregated into teachers' unions, people suddenly lose faith and trust. And it just shouldn't be the case. That was teachers speaking out very loudly and clearly about insufficient support in our schools, crumbling infrastructure, and things that weren't going to keep them safe, in the midst of the worst of the crisis. And now you see districts moving together towards getting schools reopened next year, hopefully tracking down a lot of these young people that we lost track of them or their families during this crisis, making sure they re-enroll in school. And then a lot of investment, especially here in California, in making sure that those kids that we missed or that missed out because, the online learning wasn't quite enough for them, that we get them caught up.
What do you say to the parents who really felt, and I heard from these parents where I live, that they felt like the union was advocating more for the teachers than for their students in those situations? Because there was a tipping point. I understand the argument you're making at the beginning where none of us had good information. You could argue we still have a lot of mixed messages. But to those parents who said, this is the only place my kid gets education, sometimes food, counseling, other therapies, and I've been totally cut off from that with meager results in terms of the technological attempts to sort of mitigate that. What do you say to them?
Yeah, you know what? I wouldn't lay that at the feet of teachers, though, because teachers are part of a system where elected school board officials and school districts are responsible for carrying out all of that other programming. And so, in the communities where I am, several times I went to schools that were doing meal distribution, and they would provide meals for the entire family worth of kids. It would have a snack for the afternoon, breakfast for the next day, and a lunch. And schools went way above and beyond in many instances. But what we did see in terms of that infrastructure, there were breakdowns in some communities. And again, that goes to the fact that we don't invest in our school systems here like other countries do. And so when there is a challenge of this magnitude, it is hard to fill in all of those gaps to meet the needs of, the most struggling students, the students who are on a special ed plan. And so we know we need to do better, and we need to be better prepared, hopefully for not another pandemic, but certainly for any kind of emergency that takes kids out of the regular classroom. I mean, no doubt though, it was a huge, huge challenge for families. And frankly, the other thing we recognized is how much we rely on our public school system as one of our main forms of childcare in this country, and that's something we've got to address.
Let me ask you, because you did have experience in the Department of Education, the Clinton administration, and you have spent a lot of time in Santa Clarita area schools. What do you think needs to be the prescription for recovering the lost learning for our students so that they are competitive with people from other countries around the world?
I think it's going to be a matter of good assessments and patience, and possibly adding staffing. So I, was very pleased to see the amount, is dedicated towards education in the American Rescue Plan. I know districts are going to be able to put that money to good use. In some school districts, you do see them extending now into a summer learning loss session, which I think is really promising. I think we will probably more likely see a lot of that like spring break time, winter break time, and then on into next summer as teachers have kids back in the classroom for a full year, and they can kind of do a more thorough assessment of what the learning loss was. But the other thing that I have said to to folks, especially parents who are the most concerned, is we have to recognize how resilient our kids are and how capable they are of catching up. And it's not necessarily always, the minutes on the clock that pass by that guarantee whether or not they're going to succeed, but it's the amount of support that they are getting at home and in the classroom, and people committed, to make sure that they get the achievement to the level where it needs to be. So again, I hope we come to this work as kids go back to school now and next fall, just recognizing how much support our teachers need, how much diligence I would like to see, communities come to the table with as they're going to their school board meetings and being engaged in what that looks like.
There's been a lot of rhetoric from elected officials and conservative pundits who use canards. There was recently a bipartisan bill in Congress that was just to authorize a $1 billion a year in grants to pay for more civics and history programs that teach children. And one of the reactions that came from it was Stanley Kurtz. He was talking to Breitbart News and wrote for the National Review and used terms like woke education, Marxist-based philosophy, white privilege, gender fluidity, systemic racism, and this was just a very anodyne American pie, as apple pie civics education. How would you respond? Now, that's obviously a canard, like I said, but how would you, it represents genuine fear and concern on the part of parents sending their kids to public schools. How might you respond to rhetoric like that?
Well, sure. I mean, absolutely, it's a canard, and it's so dramatically overblown, I think, for political effect. And as much as our schools are a part of our system of public governance, it doesn't serve any of us well to politicize what happens in the classroom to a large extent. But I will tell you, one of the main motivating factors for me getting back into this race again, because it is not easy to run for Congress. It doesn't come with a whole lot of good times. But is this notion that my kids, who are young adults, but certainly the generation behind them, will inherit from all of us an America that is far more racially, economically, ethnically diverse than the one that we grew up in. And if we don't give them the fundamentals, the understanding of our basic governing institutions and how they are supposed to work to serve them, to help them protect one person, one vote and the rule of law, but to give them the tools and the skill set to talk about the really challenging issues of race, of social justice, of moving together as a unified country, regardless of those differences, we will set up this country for a future of failure. I'm not going to accept that. There are ways we can do this, through education, through sharing of evidence-based practices of how we approach these conversations in a meaningful way that lead to a better future and lead to kids being comfortable with who they are and where they are, and not having those be, the conversations that predominate all aspects of public policy. But for now, they have to, because while we have litigated race and social justice in this country for decades, we realize very starkly now that it is something that does have to be re-educated and re-litigated with every generation.
So how do you avoid spending more time looking to the past than towards the future with respect to race? I think about, what's shaping this bill, of course, is the ongoing conversation and sometimes controversy over teaching critical race theory, or should you teach the past history of this country? Are we a racist country? I mean, I'm dancing on a lot of tough topics. And I'm sure you have to have your own convictions about those things because that's part of what's motivating you to get in the ring.
Sure. Well, I think you cannot do it without a backwards look. We certainly have all learned substantially from slavery in the United States, from what happened in the Holocaust. Those lessons have to be part of that every generation now re-education on these issues, and having people learn to be critical of the history and critical of the leaders and the movements and the momentum that got us into those spaces where horrific things could happen, like that, one human being to another, and how we move beyond it. And we move to a society where people can embrace difference, acknowledge difference without having it be a dividing line for every aspect of our lives. And so I do think it's important. And I think, these notions of we can't teach critical race theory are just dramatically overblown. If we care about the future of this country, these are conversations we have to have now.
Are we a racist country?
In some respects, we still are. There are remnants of institutional racism in a lot of our structures and systems, in finance and housing, in policing in some respects. And while we have moved and tried to be on a dedicated path to improvement, it is work that continually has to be done so that those standard expectations that have been historical don't rear their heads again and become bigger than they should be. And it's incredibly important. We do absolutely still have persistent racism in the country.
One of the things I know that as an educator, you must have watched, especially with young adults and with your own experience going to college, is the evolution of student lending. And when you talk about unequal outcomes for education levels, you can see, the changes in how school is funded. And I wanted to get your take on student loan debt in particular. Student loan debt has now eclipsed credit card and auto loan debt, and it's second only to mortgage debt, with about 1.7, so almost $2 trillion borrowed as of a recent Fed statistic. Do you think there's a student debt bubble?
I do. I see it in young people my kids' age, and not only the notion that their generation, the millennial generation, I think owns now about 4% of our nation's GDP. Certainly not enough for an entire generation to sustain itself on, yet they have the highest levels of debt. A number of factors have lent themselves to it: the rising cost of higher education, the fact that we don't track young people adequately. We're not giving them enough support in high school to make those decisions about whether or not technical or vocational training might be a better path for them, and then provide that to them in a free or affordable way, versus those who truly would benefit from being on a university path that end up with that kind of debt. I will be next week, I will be in San Diego for my own daughter's graduation. She is going into the teaching profession. So fortunately, her father and I were in a position where we were able to cover some, borrow some, but she is borrowing a portion on her own, and she knows what a significant responsibility that will be for her to pay that down, but also knows that, she's likely to be able to find a job that will help her to do that. But for a lot of these young people, if they have not been given good information and advice, maybe they've gone to some kind of private institution that promised them career training with a job at the end, it doesn't always come through, or even, just a regular college degree. And there's still a lot to be said for that, for a wide, liberal arts education that allows you to think more broadly about the world and be a critical thinker. But it's coming at far too great a cost. And so it is something we're absolutely going to have to grapple with as a country. I, for one, would like to start by seeing more opportunities for young people to invest, to be able to earn as they go, to be able to work on campus or be able to work in the surrounding community to help pay their way through college. But then certainly, I think we also should be considering a national service corps, where people can have that first attempt at a meaningful career after college graduation, but also give back to the country at the same time and work down what was spent on their behalf for their education. So there's no shortage of creative ways for us to deal with it. It's unfortunate that we got ourselves to the point where this is such a burden on an entire generation, but I look forward to conversations about how we can improve it and make it better.
So 2 points I would make that I've discovered about this situation is that certainly greed from these from lenders has been a piece of this, but also the federal backing of these student loans. 92% of them are backed by the U.S. government, and because that's essentially the taxpayers backing them, some people do argue that if the government didn't back these loans, that the tuition would not be skyrocketing. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I understand that perspective. I also think tuition probably would be skyrocketing because a lot of the same costs that drive costs for our business community, providing health insurance, employee wages, maintenance of facilities. I mean, here in our own UC system in California, we've got facilities where we've spent millions in recent years, but there's still millions of dollars of work to be done in rebuilding that university infrastructure for universities that have been there for decades. So, we just find ourselves in a place where we're going to have to critically rethink how much subsidy and where the federal government invests its subsidy, and perhaps backing these loans isn't the way to do it. Maybe they need to be putting more aside in direct grants and direct support to students, but at the same time investing in the critical infrastructure of the universities themselves to help bring some of those costs down. Although, which is not to be said that like any bureaucracy, any institution, you couldn't look through the American university system and find places where costs should be brought down, but you also want to recognize that they are also drivers of innovation and technology and research in the country. And that also is a tremendous value that I think we don't often talk about.
Yeah, something especially I think you could say of the California school system. One more question on that I would ask you. If you're elected to represent California 25, you're likely to have to vote on student loan forgiveness. Will you support that?
I will. I want to make sure that we've got a plan to fund it. And then what the plan looks like going forward for future generations. I mean, it shouldn't, if it's a one and done, I think we've handled it wrong. If we're not at the same time looking at, okay, but then what happens for all of these college students who come next, and making sure that they don't end up in the same position so that we're not doing this again a decade out. That's a conversation that needs to be directly in tandem.
Well, I appreciate the nuance there. Thanks. Go ahead. Sorry, Corey.
That's okay. I had the opportunity to ask several constituents here in California 25 if they had questions for you. And I was surprised to hear that more than one brought up the campaign, the 2020 campaign, something along the lines of, I couldn't turn on the TV on Sunday football without seeing Mike Garcia. I couldn't bring up a YouTube video without seeing Mike Garcia. I couldn't bring up Facebook without seeing Mike Garcia. And the complaint, if you want to call it that, was that you weren't as ubiquitous or perhaps aggressive in your campaign. I'm curious if you had it to do over again, which you actually do. What are some of the things that you're going to do differently going forward?
Well, it's a great question. And people, I had these drive-through events here in the community. And so that was really, because of COVID restrictions, our only way to engage with the public. And people would drive through and say, oh my gosh, they're nonstop attacking you on this, that, or the other thing. So that goes part and parcel with the question about money, though. And, how much money is spent on these campaigns. He had $4 million more to spend, plus independent expenditure committees coming in and really dropping a lot of money. But there was also a real coming to terms in Washington, D.C. on the Democratic side about this move to digital. And it's been well demonstrated since that Republican entities were investing in digital spaces where people were consuming their media at that point, especially because of COVID. Not everyone was sitting home and watching cable and broadcast TV. Most people now are streaming, they're getting content on their phones. That's how they're getting their news, their entertainment. And so being more present in those spaces is more important than ever. So that is one critical change that will happen this time going forward, is that I plan to have much more of a presence in those digital spaces than we had last time, and kind of recognizing, especially here in the LA media market, broadcast TV is incredibly expensive, and so probably not the best use of campaign dollars.
Yeah.
But then also, planning on being just personally present for town halls, for events where people can come and hear from me.
We've had the opportunity to talk to some of the most successful campaigners and strategists in the country. We just talked to Joe Trippi, I think I mentioned to you, who's been campaigning since before the Ted Kennedy 1980 presidential campaign. And, even more very recently got Doug Jones elected to the Senate in 2017. We also have had the opportunity to speak to folks like Reed Galen and Mike Madrid. Madrid had some specific advice, actually. He said that broadcast media is not a very efficient use, especially in this district, because you're buying the LA market really expensive and not really hitting your constituency. He had much more specific thoughts about who that proverbial 333 votes were. And he thinks
Mhm.
that if we had to really laser in, it's college educated women in this district. But
Mhm.
that's just the free advice. So if take it or leave it,
Yeah,
I'm
no,
sure.
no, and I like Mike a lot. He's usually spot on. And when I won the state assembly seat, which is actually just based on registration numbers, a harder district to win, it was very targeted digital communication.
Digital, yeah.
And then, specifically to constituencies like college educated women in some cases, where you can have a very specific messaging set, and it works really well to tailor that messaging. Certainly in the Antelope Valley, there are multiple constituencies where it just would have served us better to have that tailored messaging. So we are doing that this time.
One of the questions I had for you is that you've said, and I've seen it, that there were multiple aggressive attacks. You could even say lies that were said about you. I'd love to give you the opportunity to correct the record, maybe address some of those lies and unfairly aggressive attacks, and just set the
Sure.
record straight.
Yeah, we talked about one of them today. You asked when I had crossed over and gone against my own party, and it was on that net operating loss vote. And that's when I lost my committee leadership. There were ads and articles saying that I had lost my committee leadership for other reasons. It simply wasn't true. We hadn't had committee meetings, but that was because of COVID. We weren't in Sacramento. We weren't holding meetings in rooms with large groups of people. One of the Republican go-tos in terms of strategy now, though, and we saw it in red to blue races across the country, is to take your opponent's strength and try to turn it into their weakness. And for me, that has been that I have been a big public education advocate my entire career, have invested a lot of resource there, and it is a love and a passion of mine. So they went through public records and found years where, unfortunately, during the Great Recession, we had to issue layoff notices to teachers. And so they said I fired teachers. But I never voted to permanently fire a teacher. We gave layoff notices in the spring, as we are required to do, so that a teacher could find a new job by the following fall. But once we knew our state budget numbers by the end of June, all of those layoff notices were always rescinded. Well, of course, those NRCC ads and those Garcia ads never bothered to mention that those layoff notices were rescinded and teachers stayed on payroll. So there was a lot of abuse of the truth, a lot of reshaping of context that makes a difference in situations like these. And it's unfortunate, and it's a huge disservice to voters. If you think that little of voters, that you're just going to lead them astray for the purpose of getting a vote, what does that say about how you're going to govern our country? So it's just not something that I have a tremendous amount of respect for at all.
Where do you think some of those proverbial 333 votes are?
For me, it really was about not being able to knock on people's doors. We made a very deliberate decision to keep our volunteers and our voters safe, because in California here in September, October, November of last year, we were at the beginning of one of those peaks again. We did not want to contribute to the growing COVID crisis. And so we kept our volunteers on the phone. But if they were out knocking on doors, there were about 10,000 voters in this district who voted for President Biden, but didn't vote down ticket for me. And that's because we just didn't have that opportunity to have the conversation. Like, if you're supporting the Biden agenda, then this is the congressional candidate that you're going to want to send to Washington to help you get there. And that'll be different this time. With COVID restrictions behind us, we're going to be able to have our volunteers out in the neighborhoods again, making those meaningful connections, making sure that people do participate. I mean, the fascinating thing about this, though, is all those things considered, we still had the highest turnout for a congressional in this district that we've had. So that, I think, bodes well for us, and really proud of this district that despite all the many challenges, they still got out there and voted. And I would also say there's probably 333 people at least with a little bit of buyer's remorse right now. So we'll be talking to them too.
Well, do you think that, I know for me, I'll just be transparent. I was on election night, I was sort of rooting for the center holds result. It looked like a center holds result where the Democrats lost a few seats, but held majority, but it looked like the Senate was going to go the Republicans' way. But as we got closer to what ultimately happened on January 6th, and then what's happened since then, I did vote, for at the national level, I did vote for Biden and for you. At the local level, I still vote largely Republican. But I could see a lot of folks who think like me, conservative, fiscally, socially libertarian. I could see how folks might have voted with Mike Garcia. Do you think a lot of those 10,000 voters who voted for Biden, but also with Mike here, do you think that how he voted for to overturn the election on January 6th and January 7th for Pennsylvania and Arizona, how he voted for on impeachment, how he what some of his public rhetoric. In fact, he's started a caucus for quote unquote election integrity to sort of perpetuate all the big lie and the rhetoric around that. Do you think that's an issue that's going to stick when it comes time to vote in the fall of 2022?
I absolutely do. And it's kind of that it was incredible in the days following that, the number of people who were sending me private message by social media or commenting on social media posts about their regret for exactly that reason. And the fact that not only did he make that decision on January 6th, even after the attack on the Capitol, to stand with the others who voted against certification of election results, it is the fact that he has persisted in being one of those team players who is propagating, what's now being called the big lie. And the big lie is a foundation for arguments around voter suppression measures. And that is just not conservative, liberal, centrist, libertarian. We have got to all agree that we are still a country that our fundamental belief is in one person, one vote, and the rule of law. And our election systems have integrity. I've talked about it many times in my own race. The official in Ventura County is an elected Republican who oversees the counting of the votes. And in Los Angeles County, it is someone who is appointed by, a nearly all Democratic Board of Supervisors. Yet both of those people and their respective departments carried out with remarkable transparency the final vote counting in the case of my race. I felt completely confident, was allowed to have attorneys present in both locations to be participating in that. So, and I've heard Garcia go on to, ultra right-wing radio shows and talk about how, well, if we hadn't had lawyers in the room, stuff would have gone sideways. And it's simply not the case. You're talking about people who know how important their work is to maintaining people's faith and trust in our institutions of government. And we can't afford to shake that. We just can't. And so I do think that there are a lot of people who will hold that in particular against Mike Garcia.
Yeah, there's a lot of folks who have questions because he keeps on talking about it, and folks like him keep on talking about it. But he can continue, agreeing with the big lie or perpetuating the big lie. But I'll go with the conservative legal movement every time. I'll go with the Secretary of State, the Republican Trump supporting Secretary of State of Georgia. I'll go with the elections officials who just released a statement in Arizona who said enough is enough. 4 out of 5 of whom are Republican.
Right.
So I think the conservative legal movement, by and large, up to the Supreme Court. I mean, in Mike's response about why he voted the way he did to overturn the election results of Pennsylvania, he said that state legislatures can't just willy-nilly make laws out of thin air. It was the Republican-led state legislature that passed the law that he was talking about in October of 2019. Right. And then those same Republican elected officials are the ones who objected to their own law that they passed in October of 2019. But suspiciously, I think, they didn't object to it until after the election of 2020, over a year later. That's why their case was dismissed unanimously based on the laches doctrine, which is basically a bad faith argument. But that's my pet peeve. We could do a whole other podcast just on that.
Well, right. And it is left to the states right now. So if that's a conversation we need to have is how much of federal election protection needs to be left to the states. So that's a valid conversation to have. But when it comes to, those arguments that he has made and others have made, they're simply wrongheaded. A lot of them were passed by Republican legislatures, and those that weren't were passed by legislatures who knew that in the midst of the first global pandemic we've seen in this country since the 1920s, we needed to protect people's access to vote in a presidential election. That's what it came down to.
You need to leave the room. Excuse me, my assistant is interrupting.
That's awesome.
Close the door. Thank you for listening.
That's you're right in Christy's wheelhouse, but your daughters are just a little bit ahead of Jessica Jr.
Yeah. 3 and 6. I've got a ways to catch up.
Oh yeah. Okay. Mine are 3 years apart also. Nice.
Okay.
That's awesome. Jess, did you have a follow-up question on that?
Well, I had just been thinking about the recall and the politics around Gavin Newsom, who I know endorsed you the last time you ran. And I wonder what, if any, impact there is with what's going on in California politics on you and your race. I understand you won't be on the same ballot this fall, but how do you navigate that?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, by talking about it from this perspective of voter education. And I think a lot of the people who signed those petitions here in California to get this recall going in the first place, had they been told that, and I've heard estimates that vary widely. So low end, $40 million to administer this recall statewide, all the way up to several $100,000 to hold this recall election. A lot of them, especially those who are fiscally conservative, would have said, yeah, no, thanks. We'll live with this for another year, right? That's just a rational decision that a lot of those people would have made had they known the true cost of this. But then when you just talk about it in simple government terms, and I don't by any stretch of the imagination think that the recall folks are going to be successful. I think Gavin Newsom, who has done a phenomenal job, especially this year, stays in office. But even if they were successful, they would be getting a replacement governor for 1 year with a state legislature that has supermajorities in both houses of the opposing party. What do they think that governor is going to be able to accomplish? I mean, sure, they can veto everything that comes out of, both houses of the legislature in that final year, but that's not going to serve them well, and it's not going to serve Californians well. So I think for whatever reason, the movement happened. And I do think a lot of it was political, because you saw a lot of the recall Newsom trailers and tables and all of that kind of stuff in districts like mine that they know are going to be swing districts in 2022 to try to keep that going. It's very short-sighted. It's going to end up being very costly to the state, millions of dollars that could be spent on a number of other worthwhile things, investing in our water infrastructure because we're in a drought now. It's a big waste of time and resources.
Do you have any sense of how the districts are going to be redrawn?
We don't. But one of the things that, I think we as Californians can take a lot of solace herein is the fact that it is done with an independent citizens redistricting committee. So when I was in the state legislature, the folks who helped put that together were very, transparent with us about the application process, making sure that we had opportunities to reach out to our constituencies and community members to have a really broad reach of enticing folks to serve and be a part of it. And the entire process happens with a really well thought out set of parameters that the commissioners should consider. They're given then just the statewide demographic data. And then after they do a series of draft maps, which we'll probably see very late fall, early winter this year, the public gets to weigh in. So here in California, these are not districts that are being cut with some backroom deal and then ratified by a legislature in the middle of the night. This process really belongs to California here. If anyone's interested, they should go to We Draw the Lines to check it out and be a part of it. And it's going to be fascinating. I mean, hard part is we will be losing a congressional seat, but the great part is that Californians get to weigh in on what that looks like.
I noticed that there were, of the closest races in the 2020 election, there were a dozen Republican Congress members who also scored a D or an F on one of my favorite resources here lately, the GOP Accountability Report Card. And our current congressman got a D-, and he was also at the bottom of that list at less than 0.1%. Have I mentioned that stat before? Sorry. I'm showing my colors. I'm not a true journalist like Jessica is. I can't, the Jew from Jersey in me comes out, and I just can't help talking with my hands and saying, "What the hell are you doing?" Anyway, but I'm curious if you've been contacted by groups like Operation 147 or the GOP Accountability Project or any groups like that, because this really is one of those seats that by any standard measure should be a big target.
It is. And what I will say, not knowing too much about, that scorecard that you mentioned, though, there are groups like that all across the country. A lot of them operate here in the state of California. And some of them, though, just they end up with a really narrow focus. There's just a very small subset of issues that are incredibly important to them. And a perfectly good legislator who plays by the book and wants to make sure that budgets are balanced and that laws make sense and they don't end up having to be litigated for a decade after they've been passed, very often don't score well on those report cards, right? And so I think for the good of democracy, they're there. There are some that are simply better than others, though. And I think what's best for voters is to kind of just check in with the candidate you're looking at to the best of your ability. Try to be in a space where you can ask them questions, look at the content in the media they're putting out for themselves, but then kind of sift all of those scoring parameters accordingly, because some of them are meant to be purely political and some of them have a really narrow focus that probably doesn't get to the breadth of what that person has done in their career.
Yeah, the reason that a couple of these really resonated with me is because there are certain things, as you well know, that are very, very important to me, especially legislation that affects small business owners.
Yeah.
How right now with what's happening in Israel, I got an email from my cousins in Israel just this morning about what's happening there and how often they're having to go into their bunkers, their shelters, I should say. So there are political issues, foreign policy issues, very, very important issues. But you know something? If we can't agree on democracy itself, there's nothing else for us to talk about. That's why, Operation 147 or the GOP democracy scorecard are very, very clear prisms for me to assess it. We have nothing else to talk about. I could, somebody like the Squad, very, far left, get a lot of press, but I could see myself being in a room with folks like that because I think they share the same sense of reality, frankly, or the same sense of decency, or the same sense of being able to engage with somebody that you might disagree with about, whether life starts at conception or, how you would prioritize life issues. I could still have a conversation with folks like that, but I can't have a conversation. We can't even be in the same room and have that dialogue if we disagree on democracy itself. That's why those things I think are very important. But that's not me as the question asker interviewer. That's just
right. Well, yes,
as your potential constituent.
A couple of things. First of all, I hope your family remains safe, and I'm glad you're in contact with them. But again, yeah, I mean, it's to each their own. If these are groups and affiliations, tracking services you've been following for a long time, and you find that it lines up with where your values and your perspectives are, by all means, those are good measures that you should consult. But I think in this day and age, especially, in this era of misinformation, just literally, fake news, like sites are generated all the time just for the purpose of having, political propaganda out there. Those kind of scoring metrics end up being a part of that to greater or lesser extent. And it's just really important for voters, I think, to sift through and try to suss out which ones are balanced and a legitimate look, as you said, and which ones aren't. But yeah, I totally agree. And I have tremendous respect for AOC and members of the Squad. And I think it's important for us to conceptually remember that's why we have a representative government that we do. Those women reflect the values of the districts that sent them there. It's not going to be the same for every representative across the country. So to whatever extent they can get in a room with people like you mentioned and talk about, okay, what are the core principles we can agree on? And where does that drive us in terms of legislation that we can work on together? That's the kind of work we need to be doing. And so all of these other systemic challenges, the amount of money in our system and where it comes from, and the fact that at this point, I think people are far more vested in keeping power than they are in leading the country. Those are dangerous and slippery slopes for us to be on. And so we've got to get back to the point where, okay, let's start at the fundamental. We all agree that this is how our democracy should function, and one person, one vote, and the rule of law matters, and move forward from there.
I'm still jaded, but I wish you all the best.
Maybe when I grow up, I'll be jaded too.
I really hope that if you do come to Washington, will not only look me up, but will also make an effort to be as consistent in your intention to reach across the aisle on a personal level with other people in Congress, because I really think that's a big piece of this. It's not happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see that. I agree.
If you're elected to represent CA25, what committees do you want to be on?
Labor and education, to be sure. I care very much about what the future of the working class looks like in this country, and making sure that we keep decades old commitment to those folks, which we have through Republican and Democratic administrations, and really elevating public education to the public policy platform it deserves in this country. It gets bashed more frequently than not, but I don't hear a lot of people talking about solutions. So I will be one of those people who wants to, fly the flag for public education as a means of, shoring up our democracy, making sure that everybody gets that same level playing field with understanding how this is all supposed to work to support them eventually, and has access to opportunity.
Yeah. Well, you're talking to the right guy. Both my parents were lifelong educators, and my brother was in education for the better part of almost 25 years. And I think I told you this, Eddie is the most educated truck driver in the history of truck
I
driving.
was just going to quote you to you.
Which is incredible.
Yeah. He switched over actually just about, he was finished with his training in his first year just when we went into COVID. So he was still, in every sense of the word, an essential worker. Just this time, he was in his truck instead of in his classroom. So
maybe he could do some Zoom lessons while he's on the road.
No, he tells this funny story that, he was always a daydreamer, and he was always staring out the window, and his teachers often would say to him, Eddie, wake up. You'll never be able to make a living sitting on your butt and staring out the window. And now he's sitting on his butt and staring out his window and making a living doing it. So
we need his eyes open for that matter.
Yeah. Christy, did you have any questions for us?
Yeah. So of the folks that you guys are going to be talking to heading into this next election season, like, what are you hoping to get out of the conversations? Are you looking to drive the narrative in any way? Or are you just looking to have more of a platform and a hearing of ideas?
Yeah, so the title is a little bit long, but it says exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to talk about politics and religion without killing each other. So I want to have as many folks.
The Grim Reaper is not at your door.
I want to have as many folks from as many different in the media, in politics, elected officials, academics that are talking about really important issues and seizing some of this conversation back, because a lot of us spend way too much time listening to what I refer to as the screamers, folks who are just using false rhetoric, folks that are that give us the illusion that we can't talk to our neighbors, that we can't talk to our relatives about such issues. And if we do, that we'll lose those friendships and we'll lose those relationships.
And I would argue they've convinced a lot of people of that.
They have, but I want to take some of that space back. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
So there's going to be any number of folks that and Christy, you and I disagree on some stuff. We probably have some things that we, just from the very first time we met, that we would disagree about passionately. But the fact that we're willing to be neighborly about it and be in conversation about it and find those points where we can work together, I think that's really important work that's being done. And we want to do a lot more of it. We want to, help to be a part of this growing ecosystem that believes in truth, believes in civility, believes that Mr. Rogers is a better representative of our best selves than, the ex president.
Right.
So that's what we're trying to do. Jess, what do you think? You have a different perspective than I do.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm surrounded by the screamers. I know a lot of them personally, and it's I don't think that the ecosystem I'm in is a productive one for the country. It has more entertainment value than it does have empowering the calmer voices. And I think that's why I've been appreciative of this opportunity to be a part of something where we do talk about ideas. And podcasting gives you an opportunity to get to know somebody. I mean, I certainly feel like I could have a cup of coffee with you if and when you do come to town, because, people are people. And it's been a long time. When freshmen come in, you have this like quick moment in time where you can get to know them, and then they're sort of swept away into the machine. And I've watched it happen cycle after cycle. I don't want it to happen to you. I don't want it to happen to anybody. It's not productive for the country.
You know what though, Jess? You know what you're really good at? Crossing the divide. She's a published Jessica's a published author.
Well, that's
Come on,
I mean,
come on, give us some love. Tell us about it.
Crossing the Divide is about how to cross the divide, and it's mostly cross-cultural competency.
Mhm.
But after January 6th, I got a lot of phone calls about how do we do this in our own country, and I hadn't fully grasped how divided our own country was. I guess sort of statistically and ideologically I did, but not with the visceral. When we watched what we watched on January 6th, there was just no denying how much pent-up anger and frustration and willingness to defy all social norms, all political norms, and all respect of a piece of property that represents us all. I mean, the things that were left behind that maybe haven't even been published in the Capitol are not, the people were defecating on the US Capitol, not because they couldn't find a bathroom. I mean, that's that level of disrespect to the institution and the way that building has been a place for finding common ground and hammering out solutions. It just underscored the sort of polling and statistics that we'd seen in a way that was just wrenching. And I don't think I'm alone in that, but I don't know if until that moment I realized how much of the skills that I write about with just based on my background traveling abroad and reporting in different situations, those are very applicable down the street.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think you guys probably could do a whole series of podcasts on where we are with modern media and then the interplay of social media and how it's contributing to that. And I don't know, I'm someone who grew up watching Walter Cronkite, and we're just so far afield from what news is now compared to what news was then.
Yeah. And I don't think we're ever going back. I mean, there's one of the things I've said, and I think this is on us, and by us, I mean the media, is that we are the only profession written into the Constitution and the First Amendment. And when we fail to do our job to hold government accountable, we are failing our part of what makes democracy functional.
Absolutely.
And that's a piece of this.
I'm a little bit more optimistic, I think, than both of you, because I think that there are.
I don't know how you stay so rosy. It must be the weather over there.
No, there are still really good journalists, whether it's Washington Post, there's so many great reporters.
There are,
Bob
but
Costas
they don't have the command of the audience the way Cronkite did or the way Murrow did.
Because
where millions of people are sitting down and taking what they're reporting as gospel. I mean, very good, well-resourced and well-sourced reports are still, incredibly attacked when they don't fill in the narrative that a given perspective wants them to. And that's part of the job. It always has been, but I just don't think the machine was behind the criticism the way it is now.
Well, I think the democratization of media, including social media, is part of what the problem is, but I also think that's part of what the cure is. I've already mentioned some independent media outlets that are favorites of mine, where I think some great journalism and some great commentary is being done, like the Dispatch, like the Bulwark, but also institutions like Washington Post and New York Times. Maggie Haberman is a great reporter. Bob Costa is a great reporter. And believe it or not, I've seen great reporters on Breitbart. They still get their fair share of attacks in the comments section, but they're still doing pretty good reporting. The Washington Times. So I think good reporting is being done. It just, some of it, frankly, is just better civics education so that we can be more discerning to find those good reporters where they're happening. But like you said, I think that's up for a whole other episode.
You could do a whole podcast series on, that's a whole series right there.
Well, let's make sure how can we find you, Christy?
ChristyForCongress.org is the website. I appreciate hearing from people, and my DMs are open on Twitter, all of those different social network channels that are available. But watch this race and follow this space. If the Democrats are going to hold the House, the path to doing that goes through California, and this is one of the California 4 that we need to get back.
And Christy is CHRISTY.
I guess we should ask. Given that, are you?
What?
Yes. Christy with a Y.
ChristyForCongress.org, you said, right?
Right.
Great. Well, Christy, thank you so much for spending the time with us.
I think Jessica had another question.
Sorry, I have a question.
Sorry.
Given that the path to holding the House runs through California 25, how much outside money do you think you're going to get in support of your race? And have you already been approached? I mean, we don't have the statistics on your fundraising
Right.
for the current cycle. But I'm sure you're going to get a lot of outside money.
Right. Because we still have, primary season to go through. It's way too early to determine what that outside investment looks like. But as a candidate, you always have to assume that you're getting none. You're really on your own. And especially when it comes to that independent expenditure investment, I mean, we are legally barred, prohibited from talking to those folks in any way. And so then it's just institutional support that you get from your own party, and that comes after, winning a primary and making a good showing. So, it came in for me last time, hopeful that it will be there again this coming time.
I guess I have one more follow-up question. Do you have a sense of what the primary, what the field looks like right now?
It's really hard to say. I mean, this district has, because you've lived here, sometimes it's like the American Idol audition of congressional districts, because people from greater LA that are in these deeply safe blue seats where they've had the same member for years, anybody in the greater LA area who wants to run says, oh, well, I'll just say I'm running in CA 25. And so we end up usually with this kind of whole cast of characters who end up in our primaries here. But, right now I'm the one with the name ID. I'm the one who's doing the work. I'm already taking it directly to Mike Garcia because that's who I'm in this race to defeat, and, going from there.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, you have already proven great resilience. You lost your first race for assembly and then won 2 years later. So we know it can be done. We know you have a great deal of resilience. You got me thinking, maybe I should move a little further up the hill over the grapevine and challenge Kevin McCarthy over there in that district.
There you go. That would be awesome. I would like that.
Yeah. Well,
and scene.
Christy, it was so great to spend some time with you. Jessica, it's always great to spend some time with you. You're turning into a bit of a tsitzkemache like my dad. You know what that is, right?
I'm upstaging you?
No. Well, yeah, you are.
He does.
But rightfully
You're
so.
comparing me to
Rightfully so.
Ronnie.
In both cases, you should always upstage me. You deserve it. No, my grandfather had this expression, but it was a mispronunciation of a Yiddish word. The proper Yiddish word is tsurismache, which is
give me sorrow.
No, it's
trouble.
Like tsuris, like troublemaker.
Yeah.
But my grandfather, for some reason, called it tsitzkemache, which is string maker. So I said, Zayd, what are you calling me?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know enough Yiddish to know what tsuris is, but not enough to be able to translate. Yeah.
Well, my grandfather, in his own way, he said, well, it loses its meaning in the translation. And I said, well, try to translate it for me. He said, okay, Kor, a tsitzkemache, if bullshit was electricity, you'd be a powerhouse. That's a tsitzkemache. So we just earned our explicit rating. So there you go.
Boom.
Right. Yeah.
Drop the mic, Mike. Drop the mic, Corey. Drop it.
Know when to exit. All right. Thanks so much. It was so much fun hanging out with you.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us today. If you appreciate what you've heard here, please go to iTunes or anywhere you get your podcasts, give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. That really helps move us up the chart so others can find out what we're up to here. For Ronnie Nathan, I'm Corey Nathan, and we've been talking politics and religion without killing each other. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.